The thing I know, or rather perhaps it's more of a hypothesis, is why putting things in perspective helps you cope with loss. And this is something to do with a phenomenon of valence with respect to emotion. And there's a phenomenon such that positive valence, the idea that some emotions are positive, makes you see things in a broader perspective. So if you're in a happy mood, you take a global view of the world. You see the forest and not the trees. You see the world as connected or patterned or integrated. And if you're in a negative mood, if you have a negative emotion, if you're anxious or you're fearful or you're depressed, you tend to see the world narrowly. You see the world as fragmented, disassociated, incoherent, fragmented. And there's lots of experimental evidence that shows this. And one of the experiments, lots of people have repeated this, has to do with global and local visual bias. There's various visual processing tests, and depending upon the mood you're in, you see certain figures locally or globally. So I'm going to do one of these tests now, and I'm going to show you three figures. The standard figure is at the top, and then there's two comparison figures at the bottom. And you can tell what kind of mood you're in as to whether you see one of the standard figures, one of the comparison figures, as closer to the standard figure at the top. So here's the standard figure and the comparison figures. Now the standard figure is a square made of squares, and the two comparison figures, one's a square made of triangles and the other one is a triangle made of squares. Now, which of those is more close to the standard figure? Typically, if you're in a good mood, if you're in a positive emotion, you'll say that one, because then you take the global shape, the square shape, to be more similar. If you're in a negative mood, typically you'll say that one, because then you look at the local details, the little squares, and see that they're more similar to the little squares on the big square. So lots of experimental evidence indicates that kind of phenomenon. Here's another one. If you're in a good mood, you tend to be more inclusive in your uses of categories. So for instance, someone says, are the following things vehicles, an elevator or a camel? And people in good moods tend to say yes. People in bad moods tend to say no. So if you're in a good mood, it means you think more broadly, inclusively about the world. You say things like camels and elevators are vehicles. If you're in a bad mood, you say, no, they're not vehicles. You tend to think of the world as more fragmented. Lots of psychological empirical evidence shows this. Here's how it relates to coping with loss, because something similar happens in the opposite direction. If you see the world as fragmented, incoherent, disassociated, typically that might lead you to being in a bad mood, to being depressed, to feeling down. So if you see the world in a narrow way, this has causal effects. It makes you feel down. If you see the world as integrated, coherent, unified, if you see the world as making sense, then this causes people to have a good mood. So that's why putting things in perspective is a good way of coping with loss. Because if you put things in perspective, you make sense of the bad thing that happens and you tell a story about it. You make it fit into a pattern. And that's therefore to see the world in a global, coherent, unified way. And that oftentimes, typically, makes people feel better. So that's the kind of empirical experimental evidence that says there's really good backup to the common sense idea that putting things in perspective makes you feel better. Thank you.